London, 1977. A seemingly ordinary house, but within its walls lurked a terrifying secret, one that shook the world. The Hodgson family experienced the unimaginable. Strange knocks on the walls, furniture moving on its own, and whispers that echoed in the dead of night. But the most chilling presence was a dark figure, always watching, always near. Was it the spirit of a restless soul, or something far more sinister? Paranormal investigators stepped in, capturing evidence that defied logic and reason. Was this house truly haunted, or was it all a twisted trick of the mind? But when the horrifying truth was revealed, it left everyone questioning what they believed. Get ready to uncover the secrets of one of the most terrifying hauntings in history. The rain poured heavily over London, the sky blanketed with thick, rolling clouds. The old Hodgson house, standing at the end of Green Street, looked like any other house in the neighborhood, except for the eerie silence that seemed to shroud it. Inside, Janet Hodgson, an 11-year-old girl with curly brown hair, lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her younger brother Billy snored softly in the bed next to hers. Their mother, Peggy Hodgson, had just turned off the lights, leaving only the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through the curtains. But something felt wrong. A faint tapping echoed through the room. Janet sat up abruptly, scanning the darkness. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the room. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart pounded. Was Billy making the noise in his sleep? She turned to him. He was motionless, lost in his dreams. Then, as if answering her thoughts, the tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall. Janet swallowed hard. She reached out, pressing her hand against the cold surface. Nothing, but then a whisper slithered through the room. A voice, deep and gravelly, barely above a breath. Get out! Janet's blood turned to ice. Her body froze, her breath shallow. She turned her head, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time. Leave this house. Janet let out a strangled scream. Billy shot up, his eyes wide with fear. Janet, what's wrong? The door burst open and Peggy rushed in, flipping on the lights. What happened? Janet's lips trembled as she pointed at the wall. It talked to me. Peggy frowned, stepping closer. What do you mean, sweetheart? Janet's voice wavered. Someone whispered, it said to get out. Billy clutched his blanket. I heard it too. Peggy forced a smile, kneeling beside them. It's just your imagination, love. Maybe a bad dream, but deep inside, she wasn't convinced. Because in the silent room, as she comforted her children, a single picture frame tilted on the wall behind her, on its own. And then, ever so slowly, it fell to the ground. The next morning, the Hodgson house felt unusually still. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, but the gloom of the previous night still lingered. Peggy tried to shake off the uneasiness, but the echoes of Janet's trembling voice haunted her. It said to get out. The broken picture frame lay discarded on the table. Peggy inspected it, but there was no reasonable explanation. No drafts, no vibrations, yet the frame had fallen. Maybe it was loose, she mumbled to herself. But even as she tried to convince herself, a chill ran down her spine. In the kitchen, Janet and Billy sat quietly, pushing their breakfast around their plates. Margaret, Janet's older sister, finally spoke. You both look like you saw a ghost last night. Janet shot her a nervous glance. Maybe we did. Margaret laughed, though it sounded forced. It was probably just the wind. Old houses make weird noises. Billy shook his head. It wasn't the wind. It whispered. It said, get out. Peggy placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. That's enough. No more ghost stories, all right? I don't want you scaring yourselves. But Janet wasn't convinced. Something had changed in the house. Later that afternoon, while Peggy was at work, the children stayed home. The sky outside darkened and a strange stillness settled over the house. Janet was in the living room reading a book when a faint creaking sound echoed from the hallway. She froze, her eyes locked on the doorway. Billy? She called. No response. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The floorboards groaned under an invisible weight. Janet's hands trembled as she stood, inching toward the hallway. She peeked around the corner. Nothing. But the footsteps continued. They moved toward the staircase, and that's when she saw it. A shadow, barely distinguishable against the dim light, moved slowly up the stairs. It had no form, no face, just an inky silhouette that slithered like smoke. Janet's voice caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. The shadow reached the top of the stairs. Then, without warning, bang! The upstairs door slammed shut. Janet stumbled backward, her heart pounding wildly. She ran for Billy and Margaret, shouting, "There's something in the house." But when they returned to the staircase, everything was still. The door was wide open, the hallway empty. Margaret frowned. "Janet, there's nothing here." "I saw it," Janet insisted. "It was a shadow, I swear." Margaret sighed. "You're just imagining things. This house is old. It makes noises." But Janet knew what she saw. And as the night crept in once more, the whispers would return. The heavy air of the Hodgson house grew more unsettling with each passing night. Peggy tried her best to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the strange occurrences were becoming impossible to ignore. That evening after dinner, the family gathered in the small living room. The television crackled as it played a rerun of a cheerful sitcom. The laughter from the screen felt out of place in the tense atmosphere. Janet sat close to her mother, nervously twisting the hem of her sweater. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Margaret pretended not to notice, but even she glanced over her shoulder from time to time. Just as Peggy was about to suggest they all head to bed, the television suddenly flickered. The bright images twisted into static. Shh. The loud hiss filled the room, causing Billy to cover his ears. "Not again," Peggy muttered, tapping the side of the TV. But the screen remained engulfed in chaotic black and white fuzz. Then through the static, a sound. At first it was faint, almost like a garbled whisper. But as the moments passed, the voice grew clearer. "Leave." The room fell silent. Peggy's hands trembled as she stepped back from the TV. "Did you hear that?" Janet clutched Billy's arm. "It's the same voice. It told us to get out." Peggy, her face pale, quickly unplugged the television. The static cut out, but the eerie silence that followed was far worse. That night, Peggy tucked the children into bed, lingering longer than usual. She kissed Janet on the forehead, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's all in our heads," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. But as the house settled into the dark stillness of the night, Janet found herself unable to sleep. The shadows seemed thicker, the air colder. Then came the tapping. Her eyes flew open. The sound was coming from the wall once again, slow, deliberate. Janet pulled the blanket tightly around her, squeezing her eyes shut. "It's not real," she whispered to herself. "It's just a dream." But the tapping grew louder. Then from the shadows came the voice. Janet, her name clear as day, a low, guttural whisper. She shot up, her wide eyes darting around the darkened room. Billy stirred but did not wake. The voice called again, this time from the far corner. "Janet, come closer." Tears welled in her eyes. "Who's there?" she choked out. No response, but then the wardrobe door creaked open. Janet's breath quickened as a dark figure began to emerge. It was tall, impossibly thin. Its form blended into the shadows. Its face remained hidden, but she could feel its eyes, watching. Paralyzed with fear, Janet let out a blood-curdling scream. The door to the room burst open and Peggy rushed in, switching on the light. "What happened?" Janet sobbed, pointing to the wardrobe. "There was someone there, in the corner." Peggy quickly searched the wardrobe, throwing open its doors, but it was empty. Only clothes and old boxes. "There's nothing here," Peggy said, though her voice wavered. Janet shook her head. "I saw it. It whispered my name." Billy, now awake, clung to his mother. Margaret appeared at the door, her face etched with worry. "I believe you," Peggy whispered, pulling Janet close. But even as they tried to comfort one another, none of them noticed the dark imprint on the wall. A blackened handprint, faint but undeniable. The morning light did little to ease the oppressive atmosphere that lingered in the Hodgson house. Peggy was visibly exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. Janet barely spoke, her trembling hands betraying the fear she tried to hide. Despite Peggy's insistence that they carry on as usual, an unsettling feeling followed them. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights. It all felt like a silent warning. But the worst part was the handprint. Margaret had noticed it first. An eerie, blackened mark smeared on the bedroom wall, just beside the wardrobe. Peggy had tried to scrub it clean, but no matter how much she wiped, the mark remained. A sign. That afternoon, Peggy decided to call in a local handyman, thinking perhaps there was a logical explanation for the noises and disturbances. Mr. Graham, a stout man in his 60s, arrived with his toolbox and a skeptical smile. "Old houses like these are bound to creak," he said, inspecting the walls. Pipes expanding, floorboards settling. Nothing to worry about. But as he spoke, a sudden deep thud echoed from above. Peggy froze. "The children are at school. There's no one upstairs." Mr. Graham's smile faded. He grabbed his flashlight and cautiously climbed the narrow staircase. Peggy followed closely behind. They reached the landing and Graham peered into Janet's room. It was empty. The wardrobe stood firmly shut. Then, thud, thud, thud. The sound came from the other side of the wall. "The attic," Peggy whispered. Without hesitation, Graham pulled the cord to the attic hatch. The wooden ladder creaked as it descended. Dust particles floated in the dim shaft of light. "I'll take a look," Graham said, hoisting himself up. Peggy remained below, wringing her hands. A tense silence followed. Then suddenly, crash! The sound of something heavy falling sent Peggy stumbling backward. "Mr. Graham," she called. The handyman reappeared, his face pale. "There's no one up there, but I found this." He lowered a small, dusty box. Inside were old toys, a porcelain doll with cracked cheeks, and a faded photograph. The picture showed a young boy with hollow eyes, his expression unsettling. Scribbled on the back were the words, "Billy and 45. Peggy's breath caught. "But my Billy was born in 1970. "This isn't your Billy," Graham said grimly. "But whoever this boy was, he's still here." That night, the air in the house grew colder. Janet refused to sleep alone, clinging to her mother's side. Even Margaret kept her door open, unwilling to face the dark alone. But as the clock struck 3 a.m., the whispers returned. "Janet?" Her eyes flew open. The voice was closer this time, rasping through the air like dry leaves. She squeezed her mother's hand, but Peggy remained fast asleep. Janet's gaze drifted toward the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, revealing the darkened hallway. And then, she saw it. A figure, motionless, watching. The shadow loomed unnaturally tall, its form barely human. Cold, empty eyes gleamed from within the darkness. "You cannot stay." Janet's scream pierced the night. Peggy bolted upright, her heart racing. "Janet, what is it?" But by the time she turned to look, the figure was gone. Only the lingering sense of dread remained. Peggy wrapped her trembling daughter in her arms. "We're leaving," she whispered, the finality in her voice clear. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the house had no intention of letting them go. The morning came, but the sense of dread lingered. Peggy was determined to get her children out of the house. The fear in Janet's eyes had been enough to convince her. "We're leaving today," Peggy declared, her voice firm as she packed a small bag with essentials. "We'll stay with Aunt Mary for a while." Janet and Billy clung to each other, both desperate to escape the suffocating presence that seemed to seep from every corner of the house. Even Margaret, though skeptical, couldn't deny the fear that now gripped them all. But the house wasn't done with them yet. As Peggy reached for the front door, the air shifted. A low, oppressive chill swept through the room. She turned the knob, but it refused to budge. Peggy frowned. "It's stuck." She tried again, twisting harder, but the door didn't move. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. "Let me try," Margaret offered. But her efforts were equally futile. The door didn't even rattle. It was sealed. "Maybe the back door," Peggy said, forcing calm into her voice. The family hurried through the narrow hallway to the kitchen. The old wooden back door creaked as Peggy unlocked it. But when she pulled, slam! The door shut on its own as though an unseen force had yanked it from her grasp. Janet whimpered. "It doesn't want us to leave." Desperation set in. Peggy tried the windows next. She pulled at the latches, banged on the glass, but nothing gave way. Every exit was sealed. "We're trapped," Margaret whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "Call someone," Billy pleaded. Peggy grabbed the telephone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. But instead of the familiar ring, silence. Then a low, distorted hum echoed through the receiver. And from somewhere deep within the house came a faint, guttural laugh. A cold sweat broke across Peggy's forehead. "We'll find a way," she said, trying to reassure them, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Hours passed. The family huddled together in the living room, too afraid to move. The oppressive energy in the house grew heavier with each moment. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker. Every creak of the floorboards made their hearts race. Then, without warning, the lights began to flicker. Click, click, click. The bulbs overhead dimmed, casting twisted shadows along the walls. Janet's breathing quickened. "Mom," she whimpered, clutching Peggy's arm. And then the whisper returned. "Janet, come to me." It was louder this time, resonating through the walls like a distant echo. But the voice was not alone. From the hallway, the sound of dragging footsteps. A slow, heavy thud. Peggy held her children close. "Stay here." "No, Mom," Janet cried, but Peggy stood. Her trembling legs carried her toward the hallway. She had to see. She had to know what they were dealing with. As she turned the corner, the air grew icy. The dim glow from the flickering light barely illuminated the shadows that danced along the cracked walls. And then she saw it. A figure, tall, skeletal, looming at the end of the hallway. Its hollow eyes burned with malice. Its mouth twisted into an unsettling grin. "You can't leave," it whispered. Peggy stumbled back, gasping for breath. But before she could scream, the figure vanished. Only the echo of its voice remained. The house had made its intentions clear. It would never let them go. The air inside the Hodgson house grew heavier. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with the sinister presence that refused to release its grip. Peggy's hands trembled as she bolted the living room door behind her, trying to shield her children from whatever had just revealed itself. "Mom," Janet whispered, her voice shaking. "It doesn't want us to leave. It said we can't." Peggy's heart sank. The voice, that awful guttural whisper, it still echoed in her mind. She knelt beside her daughter, cupping Janet's face in her trembling hands. "We'll find a way," she promised, though the words felt hollow. The hours crawled by, the family barely spoke. Every creak of the house sent a jolt of fear through them. Peggy tried the phone again. Still dead. The television flickered, then shut itself off. Even the clocks on the walls had stopped, frozen at 3:07 a.m. Then without warning, the living room lights began to flicker violently. Pop! The bulbs burst, one by one, plunging the room into darkness. Billy screamed. Peggy fumbled for the flashlight she had left on the table. But before she could grab it, boom! A thunderous bang erupted from upstairs. Boom, boom, boom. It sounded like heavy furniture being thrown against the walls. Margaret clutched Billy tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," Peggy commanded, though her own legs trembled. The staircase groaned beneath Peggy's feet as she ascended. The dim moonlight through the cracked windows cast eerie shadows along the peeling wallpaper. She could feel it, the presence, watching, waiting. When she reached the landing, the air was ice cold. Janet's bedroom door stood wide open. The temperature inside was frigid. Peggy's breath misted in the air. "Is anyone here?" she called out, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. Silence. Unbearable, suffocating silence. Then, creak, the wardrobe door slowly swung open. Inside, in the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes stared back. Peggy stumbled backward, her scream caught in her throat. But before she could react, bang! The door slammed shut with a deafening force. A low growl rumbled through the room. Peggy bolted downstairs, her face pale. "It's not just a spirit," she gasped. "It's something worse. It's angry." Janet buried her face in her mother's chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What does it want from us?" Before Peggy could answer, crash! The coffee table slid across the room on its own, slamming into the wall. The sofa shook violently. Family photos toppled from the shelves, shattering on the floor. "Get away from the walls!" Peggy yelled, pulling her children toward the center of the room. But the chaos didn't stop. The cupboards in the kitchen flung open, dishes crashing to the floor. And then, the sound of disembodied laughter, mocking. The darkness inside the Hodgson house was absolute. Even the faint glow from the streetlights outside seemed unwilling to penetrate the oppressive shadows that wrapped around them. Peggy clutched Janet and Billy tightly. Margaret, though trying to stay composed, couldn't hide the tremble in her hands. The laughter, that sinister, guttural sound, had finally stopped. But the silence that followed was far worse. "Mom," Janet whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's still here." Peggy could feel it too, a presence, cold, unrelenting. The air felt thick, as though it resisted every breath she took. "We need light," Peggy said, her voice trembling. She fumbled for the flashlight on the side table, but as she clicked it on, the beam flickered once, then died. "Not even the torch works," Margaret muttered. "Stay close to me," Peggy said firmly. "No one moves alone." Slowly, the family crept through the darkened house. Every step on the creaking wooden floor echoed through the stillness. The once familiar walls now seemed distorted, like the house itself was shifting, changing. As they reached the narrow hallway, a faint whisper slithered through the air. Janet, the sound was barely perceptible, but Janet's breath caught. "It knows my name," she whimpered. Peggy pulled her daughter closer. "Don't listen to it," but the whispers continued. "Janet, come, play." A sudden thud from above made everyone jump. The noise came from Janet's room, the wardrobe. "We can't go back up there," Margaret said, her voice trembling. Peggy shook her head. "We have no choice." The climb up the stairs was torturous. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the shadows shifting unnaturally along the walls. Peggy's heart pounded as she reached the landing. Janet's bedroom door was ajar. The darkness inside felt palpable. Peggy hesitated. Then the sound of low breathing drifted from within. She pushed the door open. The wardrobe stood eerily still, its large wooden frame looming like a silent sentinel. Peggy's trembling hands reached for the handle. She flung it open, but it was empty. Then from the corner of the room, the whispers returned. "I'm not in there." Peggy spun around. The room was empty, but the air had grown unbearably cold. Janet stared at the far wall, her eyes wide. "Mom," she whimpered. "Look." Peggy's gaze followed her daughter's. The wallpaper was peeling away, revealing something beneath. Words, scrawled in jagged, childlike writing. "Let me stay." The words repeated over and over, some lines overlapping, others dripping as though freshly written. Peggy stumbled back, her mind racing. "We have to end this," she whispered. "Whatever it is, it's getting stronger." Margaret nodded. "We need help, real help. Who would believe us?" Peggy's voice cracked, but Margaret stood firm. "There are people who investigate this kind of thing, paranormal experts. We need someone who understands what's happening." Peggy hesitated. The thought of strangers in their home, witnessing the terror they endured, filled her with unease, but there was no other choice. "All right," she finally said, "we'll call them." But even as the decision was made, Peggy couldn't shake the feeling that the house was listening, that it knew, and it wasn't going to let go so easily. Morning arrived, but the Hodgson house remained shrouded in an eerie stillness. The oppressive atmosphere lingered, as if the house itself was waiting, anticipating what was to come. Peggy barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant whisper in the night kept her on edge. But now, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the cracked windows, a sliver of hope emerged. Help was on the way. By midday, the knock at the front door startled the family. Peggy rushed to answer it, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door. Standing outside were Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, two members of the Society for Psychical Research. Maurice, an older man with kind eyes and a steady demeanor, offered a reassuring nod. Guy, a tall, sharp-eyed investigator, carried a notebook in one hand and a tape recorder in the other. "Mrs. Hodgson?" Maurice asked gently. "Yes," Peggy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming." Maurice stepped inside, immediately sensing the oppressive energy that filled the space. "You're not imagining this," he said, his voice firm. "We've seen cases like this before, but not like this," Guy muttered, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. "The level of activity you described, it's extraordinary." After introductions, the investigators set up their equipment: tape recorders, cameras, electromagnetic field detectors. Every corner of the house was meticulously documented. "Tell us everything," Maurice said, settling into the worn armchair. Peggy hesitated. The memories of the past few days flooded her mind. The whispers, the slamming doors, the terrifying apparition in the hallway. "It started with small things," she began. "Knocking sounds, furniture moving, then the voice, or sauce." Maurice exchanged a glance with Guy. "The voice, did you hear it often?" Peggy nodded. "It called for Janet. It spoke to her." Janet shifted uncomfortably, the fear evident in her eyes. "It knows my name," she whispered. "It wants me." Maurice leaned forward, his expression concerned. "Has it ever harmed you?" Janet swallowed hard. "Not yet." That night, the investigators stayed in the house. Maurice placed a tape recorder in Janet's room, hoping to capture evidence of the voice. The family huddled in the living room, unwilling to sleep. Hours passed. The house remained unnaturally silent. The ticking of the old clock on the wall was the only sound that filled the space. Then, at precisely 3:07 a.m., the temperature dropped. A sudden, violent bang erupted from upstairs. The sound was deafening, as though something massive had crashed to the floor. Peggy gasped. "It's starting," Guy whispered. Maurice grabbed the recorder and motioned for Guy to follow. "Stay here," he instructed the family. "We'll handle this." As the investigators climbed the stairs, the air grew colder. The oppressive energy grew stronger with each step. Maurice's flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows along the cracked walls. They reached Janet's room. The wardrobe door stood ajar, swaying slightly. Guy lifted the recorder, his hand steady. "Is there anyone here?" Maurice called out. "We mean you no harm. Speak to us." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a low, guttural voice echoed from the shadows. "Leave." Guy's eyes widened. "Did you get that?" Maurice nodded, his face pale, loud and clear. But before they could react, the wardrobe door slammed shut with a thunderous force. The floorboards beneath them shook. The voice returned, louder this time. "You can't save her." Maurice's hand trembled as he clutched the recorder. "We'll see about that," he whispered. The house had made its intentions clear. but so had they. The chilling voice still echoed through the house, its sinister words lingering in the air. Maurice and Guy stood frozen in Janet's room, the oppressive cold wrapping around them. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the house was breathing, aware of their presence. Maurice's hands trembled slightly as he checked the recorder. The device's small red light blinked steadily, confirming it had captured everything. "We got it," he whispered, though his voice carried little relief. But before they could leave, a faint sound emerged, a low, rhythmic creaking, like the slow swing of a rocking chair. Both men turned toward the corner of the room. There was nothing, just the shadowy outline of the wardrobe and the peeling wallpaper. Then came the whisper, "Janet." Downstairs, Peggy held her children tightly, her heart pounding. Every noise from above sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Margaret kept glancing toward the staircase, dread in her eyes. "I can't stand it," Peggy murmured. "What if it hurts them?" Margaret placed a trembling hand on her mother's arm. "They know what they're doing, Mom. They'll be all right." But even she wasn't convinced. Upstairs, Maurice and Guy carefully made their way down the hall. The atmosphere grew heavier. The air reeked of something old and damp, like rotting wood. "We need answers," Maurice said, his voice steady. "If it's willing to speak, we'll listen." They set up the recorder on a small table in the hallway. Guy lit a candle, the flame flickering wildly in the cold air. Maurice took a deep breath. "If there's a spirit here, we ask that you communicate with us. Who are you? What do you want?" Silence. Then a faint tapping began, rhythmic, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. Guy's eyes widened. "It's responding." Maurice nodded. 1 tap for yes, 2 taps for no. "Are you here with us now?" A single sharp tap. The investigators exchanged a glance. Maurice continued, "Are you the one speaking to Janet?" Another tap. "Yes." "Why?" Maurice's voice remained calm, though his pulse quickened. "What do you want from her?" There was no response, only silence. But just as Guy prepared to end the session, the voice returned. "She is mine." A sudden crash echoed from the far end of the hallway. The candle's flame sputtered, but didn't go out. The investigators spun toward the noise, but nothing was there. The shadows danced along the walls, shifting unnaturally. "This presence," Guy whispered, his voice trembling. "It's more than just a spirit, it's violent." Maurice swallowed hard. "We're dealing with a poltergeist, and it's growing stronger." They quickly packed up the equipment and retreated downstairs. When Maurice and Guy entered the living room, Peggy rushed to them. "What happened?" she demanded. Fear etched across her face. "We made contact," Maurice said, his voice low. "It's intelligent and dangerous." "But why Janet?" Peggy's voice cracked. "Why is it after her?" Maurice hesitated. "Spirits often latch onto those most vulnerable." Janet's fear might be giving it strength. Janet, sitting silently by the fireplace, clutched her knees. "It won't leave me alone," she whispered. "Even when I close my eyes, it's there." "We'll find a way," Maurice assured her. "But we need more information. We need to understand who or what this spirit is." Guy nodded. "Tomorrow we'll search through the house's history. There must be something we're missing." But as they spoke, the temperature dropped once more. A deep, guttural laugh echoed from the shadows, and the words came again. "You can't save her." The house was far from done. The ominous laughter faded, but its lingering presence suffocated the air. The Hodgson family huddled together, their expressions etched with fear. Maurice and Guy exchanged a knowing glance. The house was not finished with them. "We need answers," Maurice said firmly. "Whatever is tormenting Janet, it's tied to this place." "Then we find out why," Guy added. "Tomorrow we'll dig into the history of this house. There's something it wants us to know." But Peggy shook her head, her voice trembling. "What if it doesn't want us to know? What if it punishes us for trying?" Maurice placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's a risk we have to take. The investigation begins." The next morning, the investigators left for the local archives. The town library was an imposing ancient building, its dusty corridors lined with records dating back over a century. A stern librarian guided them to the historical section, where stacks of old newspapers, property records, and faded photographs awaited. "We'll start with the property's ownership history," Maurice suggested, flipping through the yellow documents. "Let's see who lived here before." Hours passed. Guy scanned through the papers while Maurice took detailed notes. And then, finally, a name emerged. William Grayson. "Who was he?" Guy asked, leaning closer. Maurice furrowed his brow. "A tenant from the 1940s. It says he lived here alone," but he trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "He died in this house." "Cause of death?" Maurice scanned further. "Apparent suicide." Neighbors reported he had grown increasingly unstable, claimed he heard voices, saw things no one else could see. Guy's face paled, and the voice we heard last night, it was male. Maurice nodded grimly. It could be him. But there was more. Flipping through a fragile newspaper clipping, Maurice's heart sank. William Grayson was suspected of harming several children in the neighborhood before his death. Though evidence was scarce, many believed he was responsible for their disappearances. He died before he could stand trial. The pieces clicked into place. That spirit, Guy murmured. It's not just any poltergeist. It's malicious, angry, and it's feeding off Janet's fear. Maurice's jaw tightened. We need to tell the Hodgsons. The spirits hold back. At the house, the tension had thickened. Janet remained distant, her vacant gaze locked on the empty fireplace. Peggy tried to console her, but the girl barely responded. When Maurice and Guy returned, they wasted no time. The spirit haunting this house, Maurice began, was a man named William Grayson. He died here under dark circumstances. Peggy's face paled. What did he do? Maurice hesitated. He was accused of harming children. Though he's gone, the evil he carried seems to have lingered. Why Janet? Peggy's voice cracked. Guy explained softly. Poltergeists are drawn to turmoil. They latch on to fear, anger, and unresolved emotions. Janet is vulnerable, and Grayson is using that. Janet, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. Her voice was hollow. He whispers to me, she said, tells me I can never leave, that I belong to him. Morris knelt before her, his eyes kind but firm. That's not true, Janet. He has no power over you, but we need you to be strong. Can you do that? Janet nodded slowly, though tears welled in her eyes. We'll cleanse this house, Maurice continued, but first we must face him, understand what he truly wants. The first confrontation that night, the investigators set up their equipment once again. Cameras lined the hallways, while the recorder was placed in Janet's room. This time, Maurice and Guy remained inside with Janet and Peggy. We're giving him no choice, Maurice whispered. He will speak, and we will listen. The clock struck 3 a.m. Almost immediately, the temperature plummeted. The shadows along the walls writhed, twisting unnaturally. Then came the knock. 3 loud, deliberate bangs from the wardrobe. Janet flinched, clutching Peggy's arm. William Grayson, Maurice called, his voice steady. We know who you are. We know what you did. The air grew heavier. The lights flickered. You can't hide, Guy added. Why are you still here? A deep, guttural growl erupted from the shadows. The voice that followed was unmistakable. She is mine. Maurice clenched his jaw. No, she is not. You have no power here. The voice responded with a violent crash. The wardrobe doors flew open, revealing only darkness within. But from that darkness, a single phrase echoed. We'll see. The battle for Janet's soul had begun. The malevolent voice echoed through the room, sending a shiver down everyone's spine. The house seemed to pulsate with dark energy, as though it fed off the fear in the air. Janet clung to her mother, her breathing shallow, while Maurice and Guy maintained their composure. Maurice stepped forward, his voice steady. William Grayson, you have no right to remain here. You cannot harm this family. But the air around them shifted, the shadows darkened. The floorboards creaked under an unseen presence. And then, Janet's body stiffened. Her eyes fluttered as if she were struggling against an invisible force. Her lips parted, but the voice that emerged wasn't hers. You think you can stop me? The guttural tone reverberated through the walls. Maurice's heart pounded, but he remained firm. Let her go, he commanded. Janet's head tilted unnaturally, her expression contorted. It was as if she was fighting from within. Her trembling hands clutched at her chest, and a single tear slipped down her pale face. Help me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Peggy sobbed, holding her daughter tightly. Please, make it stop. A desperate plan. The investigators knew they were running out of time. Janet's possession was becoming stronger, the spirit feeding on her fear and vulnerability. We can't wait any longer, Maurice said, pacing the dimly lit living room. We need to perform a cleansing ritual now. But it could provoke the spirit, Guy cautioned. It's dangerous. Maurice nodded. It already is. Peggy, though visibly shaken, spoke up. I'll do anything to save my daughter. Then we have to act fast, Maurice replied. Every minute we wait, the spirit's hold on her strengthens. The ritual begins. The house was eerily silent as Maurice and Guy prepared the space. White candles lined the edges of the living room, their flames flickering against the cracked walls. A small wooden table held a bowl of salt, holy water, and protective charms. The 3 ominous knocks faded, but their chilling presence lingered. Janet stirred weakly in her mother's arms, her eyes flickering open. The air remained thick with a suffocating tension, as though the house itself was alive. watching their every move. Maurice glanced at Guy, his jaw clenched. "It's not over." "No," Guy agreed. "Not yet." Peggy's tear-streaked face was twisted with worry. "But Janet, she's awake. She's herself again." Maurice knelt beside the girl. "How do you feel, Janet?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tired, but it's quiet now." But Maurice knew the silence was temporary. The spirit wasn't gone. It was lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. "We have to find out what it wants," Maurice said firmly. "Why it's still bound to this house." The hidden truth. The next morning, after ensuring Janet was resting, Maurice and Guy returned to the archives. The name William Grayson haunted them, but something about the spirit's refusal to leave unsettled Maurice. There was more to the story. "I've been thinking," Maurice said as they sifted through old newspapers and documents, "the way the spirit reacted last night. It wasn't just rage, there was something else. Regret, maybe." Guy frowned. "You think he's trapped by guilt or by something unresolved?" Maurice replied. "We need to know how he died. Maybe that's the key." After hours of searching, Guy's voice broke the silence. "Here, look at this." He slid a faded obituary across the table. "William Grayson, 46, found dead in his home under mysterious circumstances. Authorities ruled it as a suicide, though reports from neighbors suggest he believed he was haunted by the spirits of the children he was accused of harming. Despite the allegations, no concrete evidence was ever found." Maurice's eyes narrowed. "No evidence?" Guy nodded. "He was never convicted. The accusations ruined his life, but no one could prove anything." "Then what if he wasn't guilty?" Maurice suggested. "What if the spirit we're dealing with isn't just William?" Guy's face paled. "You mean something else could be here?" Maurice's voice dropped to a whisper. "And it may be far worse." Janet's visions. Back at the Hodgson house, Janet sat in the dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the cracked wallpaper. Her mother hovered nearby, watching her anxiously. "Are you feeling any better, love?" Peggy asked gently. Janet nodded, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "It's quiet, but I still feel him." Peggy's heart sank. "We're going to stop this, I promise." But Janet's voice grew distant. "I see things now, Mom. Even when I close my eyes." "What do you see, sweetheart?" Janet's gaze darkened. "A man. He's crying, and there's a shadow behind him. It watches him, whispers to him. It told him to do terrible things." Peggy's breath caught. "The spirit. It wasn't just him." Janet nodded. "It was always with him. It still is." Confronting the darkness. That night, Maurice and Guy returned with grim expressions. "We found something," Maurice said. "William Grayson may not have been the only spirit in this house. He believed he was haunted, tormented by something far darker." Peggy clutched her chest. The morning sunlight filtered through the cracked windows of the Hodgson house. The air felt lighter, no longer thick with the ominous presence that had plagued it for so long. But despite the sense of relief, an unsettling silence lingered. Janet sat on the living room couch, bundled in a blanket. Her mother hovered nearby, nervously watching her every move. Maurice and Guy, though visibly exhausted, remained on edge. "It's gone, isn't it?" Peggy asked, her voice trembling. Maurice nodded slowly. "The entity that tormented William Grayson has been released." But what?" Peggy's eyes filled with fear. "There's still something here," Maurice admitted. "It's faint, but the house still holds a residue. The memories, the trauma, they've left a mark." Janet's voice broke the silence. "I can still hear whispers sometimes, like echoes." Maurice knelt beside her. "That's not uncommon. Spirits leave impressions behind, especially when the energy has been so strong. But those whispers can't harm you now." Or so he hoped. A house of secrets. For that afternoon, as the house fell into a deceptive calm, Maurice and Guy decided to investigate further. The walls of the Hodgson home held a story, one that was yet to be fully uncovered. "I keep thinking about William Grayson," Guy said, flipping through the old documents. "He was tormented, yes, but why did the entity target him?" Maurice frowned. The accusations against him were never proven. What if the spirit wasn't trying to punish him, but manipulate him? Drive him to the brink? Guy nodded. And now it tried to do the same to Janet. They continued their search, sifting through old records, police reports, and historical archives. It was then that Maurice stumbled upon something chilling. A photograph. It was an old black and white image of the Hodgson house, taken over a century ago. But in the background, barely visible, stood a shadowy figure near the window. "The house had a history long before the Hodgsons," Maurice murmured. "This spirit, it may be much older than we thought." Janet's nightmare. That night, Janet tossed and turned in her sleep. The lingering whispers had grown louder. Shadows flickered along her bedroom walls, dancing in twisted, unnatural forms. In her dream, she stood in the darkened hallway of her home. The air was thick, heavy with an unseen presence. At the end of the corridor, a door creaked open. A figure emerged. It was a man, Hollow eyes, pale, sunken face. His hands trembled and his mouth twisted in agony. "Why didn't you help me?" Janet's voice shook. "I don't know you." The tension in the Hodgson house clung to the air like a thick fog. Though the malevolent entity had seemingly vanished, the unsettling sense of something unfinished remained. Maurice and Guy knew that until the truth was unearthed, the house would never truly be free. "I want to try something," Maurice said, his voice resolute. "A cleansing isn't enough. We need to uncover whatever is still bound to this place." "What are you suggesting?" Guy asked, though he already sensed the answer. "We searched the house, every corner, every wall." Maurice's eyes darkened. "This house has secrets, and we're going to find them." The search begins. Armed with flashlights and determination, Maurice, Guy, and Peggy began their search. Every creaky floorboard and faded wall seemed to whisper forgotten stories. Janet remained under the watchful eye of her neighbor, away from the lingering energies. They scoured the basement, its damp walls echoing with a chilling silence. The attic, with its dust-laden trunks, held nothing but the remnants of a forgotten past. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that twisted unnervingly. Just as frustration threatened to take hold, Peggy's voice called out from the hallway. "Here, I think I found something." Maurice and Guy rushed to her side. She stood before the far wall near the staircase, her trembling fingers tracing the uneven surface. "There's something behind this," she whispered. "I can feel it." Guy leaned in, his ear against the wall. "It's hollow." Without hesitation, Maurice grabbed a crowbar. With each forceful strike, the wall crumbled away, revealing a hidden door. Its aged wood bore scratches and stains, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. "What is this?" Peggy gasped. Maurice's voice was barely a whisper. "The truth." The forgotten room. With a heavy groan, the door creaked open. A gust of stale, putrid air rushed past them. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a small, windowless room. It was empty, but the walls told another story. Scratches lined the surface, etched by trembling hands. Faint traces of blood stained the corners. Among the scribbles, a single phrase repeated over and over. "Forgive me." Peggy's voice cracked. "Oh my God." Maurice swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a prison," Guy murmured. "The lost soul." Maurice knelt, brushing away the dust from the floor. Beneath the dirt, he uncovered something more unsettling. A rusted chain anchored to the wall. The weight of the past settled upon them. "Someone was kept here," Maurice said, his voice low. "But who?" Then Peggy's trembling voice broke the silence. "William Grayson." Maurice looked at her, confused. "He wasn't the monster they claimed he was," she continued, tears welling in her eyes. "He was a victim. The entity didn't just torment him. It trapped him." Guy's voice was barely audible, and it drove him to madness. A cold wind swept through the room. The walls groaned, as though the house itself mourned. A plea for release. "We need to finish this," Maurice said firmly. "William's spirit isn't at peace. He's still bound here." "But how do we set him free?" Peggy asked, her hands trembling. Maurice reached into his bag, pulling out a small vial of holy water and a bundle of white sage. "We perform a ritual of release, a final prayer to cleanse this space." As they began, the air thickened. The shadows in the corner seemed to pulse, restless. Maurice's voice remained steady. "William Grayson, your suffering has ended. You are no longer bound to this place. Find peace and let the light guide you." A low moan echoed through the room. The shadows twisted, and for a fleeting moment, a figure appeared. A man, hollow-eyed and sorrowful. The tension in the Hodgson house clung to the air like a thick fog. Though the malevolent entity had seemingly vanished, the unsettling sense of something unfinished remained. Maurice and Guy knew that until the truth was unearthed, the house would never truly be free. "I want to try something," Maurice said, his voice resolute. "A cleansing isn't enough. We need to uncover whatever is still bound to this place." "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though he already sensed the answer. "We searched the house, every corner, every wall." Maurice's eyes darkened. "This house has secrets, and we're going to find them." The search begins. Armed with flashlights and determination, Maurice, Guy, and Peggy began their search. Every creaky floorboard and faded wall seemed to whisper forgotten stories. Janet remained under the watchful eye of her neighbor, away from the lingering energies. They scoured the basement, its damp walls echoing with a chilling silence. The attic, with its dust-laden trunks, held nothing but the remnants of a forgotten past. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that twisted unnervingly. Just as frustration threatened to take hold, Peggy's voice called out from the hallway. "Here, I think I found something." Maurice and Guy rushed to her side. She stood before the far wall near the staircase, her trembling fingers tracing the uneven surface. "There's something behind this," she whispered. "I can feel it." Guy leaned in, his ear against the wall. "It's hollow." Without hesitation, Maurice grabbed a crowbar. With each forceful strike, the wall crumbled away, revealing a hidden door. Its aged wood bore scratches and stains, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. "What is this?" Peggy gasped. Maurice's voice was barely a whisper. "The truth." The forgotten room, with a heavy groan, the door creaked open. A gust of stale, putrid air rushed past them. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a small, windowless room. It was empty, but the walls told another story. Scratches lined the surface, etched by trembling hands. Faint traces of blood stained the corners. Among the scribbles, a single phrase repeated over and over. "Forgive me." Peggy's voice cracked. "Oh my God." Maurice swallowed the bile rising in his throat. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a prison, Guy murmured. The lost soul. Maurice knelt, brushing away the dust from the floor. Beneath the dirt, he uncovered something more unsettling. A rusted chain anchored to the wall. The weight of the past settled upon them. "Someone was kept here," Maurice said, his voice low. "But who?" Then Peggy's trembling voice broke the silence. "William Grayson." Maurice looked at her, confused. "He wasn't the monster they claimed he was," she continued, tears welling in her eyes. "He was a victim. The entity didn't just torment him, it trapped him." Guy's voice was barely audible, and it drove him to madness. A cold wind swept through the room. The walls groaned as though the house itself mourned. A plea for release. "We need to finish this," Maurice said firmly. "William's spirit isn't at peace. He's still bound here." "But how do we set him free?" Peggy asked, her hands trembling. Maurice reached into his bag, pulling out a small vial of holy water and a bundle of white sage. "We perform a ritual of release, a final prayer to cleanse this space." As they began, the air thickened. The shadows in the corner seemed to pulse, restless. Maurice's voice remained steady. "William Grayson, your suffering has ended. You are no longer bound to this place. Find peace and let the light guide you." A low moan echoed through the room. The shadows twisted, and for a fleeting moment, a figure appeared. A man, hollow-eyed and sorrowful. Days passed since the entity was seemingly vanquished. The Hodgson house felt lighter, and laughter once again filled its walls. Peggy remained cautious but hopeful. Janet no longer woke screaming in the night. Maurice and Guy believed their work was done. Yet, something lingered. Maurice couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he passed a reflective surface, a mirror, a window, he caught glimpses of something, a shadow, a fleeting figure, gone before he could react. Residual energy, Guy suggested when Maurice confided in him. The house endured so much. It'll take time to fully clear. But Maurice wasn't convinced. The unseen processed one evening as Peggy tucked Janet and Margaret into bed. The youngest daughter whispered, "Mom, he's still here." Peggy's heart pounded. "Who, sweetheart?" "The man in the corner." Peggy froze, glancing to the dim corner of the room. Nothing was there, just shadows. "Don't be silly, love. It's only your imagination." She kissed Janet's forehead, though her own anxiety lingered. But as she left the room, Janet's voice followed her. "He's watching." The strange occurrences returned. The following night, the disturbances resumed. Objects moved without explanation. Distant knocks echoed through the walls. The air grew cold, and an oppressive energy settled once more. Maurice and Guy were called back, their concern growing. Despite the cleansing, the house was far from free. "We need to contact the spirit again," Maurice said. "Whatever remains here is not finished." This time, Maurice decided on a different method. Mirror scrying, an ancient practice. It involved using a reflective surface to peer beyond the veil. A large blackened mirror was placed in the living room, candles illuminating its polished surface. The family watched nervously as Maurice sat before it. "If there is a spirit among us," Maurice called, "show yourself." The mirror's surface shimmered. At first, nothing, but then faint shapes twisted and formed. A shadowy figure emerged, not Samuel Redgrave, nor William Grayson, a woman. Her eyes hollow and sunken, her lips parted as though she were screaming. Peggy gasped. "Who is she?" The figure's voice echoed from the mirror. "Help me." Maurice's hands shook as he addressed the spirit. "Who are you?" The woman's reflection wavered. "Eleanor, why are you here?" "I was taken, bound to the darkness. I never left." Maurice's breath caught. Eleanor had been another victim, a spirit, consumed by the malevolent force Samuel Redgrave had unleashed. "We can help you," Maurice said firmly, "but you must show us What happened? The mirror darkened, and horrific visions unfolded. Eleanor, shackled in the hidden room beneath the house. The walls bore her bloodied handprints. Her muffled screams went unheard. She had died within those walls, forgotten. Tears welled in Peggy's eyes. We have to help her. Maurice nodded. We'll perform a final ritual, this time to release Eleanor's spirit. As the candles flickered, Maurice led the ceremony. They called upon the light, urging Eleanor to step away from the shadows. Eleanor, your suffering ends tonight. Walk into the light. Be free. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room. The mirror cracked, but the figure within smiled, a look of peace washing over her face. And then she was gone. The Hodgson house grew still. For the first time in months, the silence was not oppressive, but comforting. Eleanor's spirit had found freedom, and whatever dark force had once held her captive was no more. Peggy hugged her daughters tightly, tears of relief streaming down her face. Maurice and Guy exchanged a weary but satisfied glance. It's finally over, Maurice whispered. But as they stepped outside, a subtle breeze carried the faintest whisper, thank you. And with that, the house was at peace. The days following Eleanor's release were the most peaceful the Hodgson family had experienced in months. No more knocks in the night, no chilling whispers, and no shadows creeping in the corners. Peggy felt a weight lifted from her chest, and Janet's once restless nights were now quiet. Maurice and Guy, though relieved, remained cautious. They knew how deceptive spirits could be. Even though Eleanor had found peace, the house still bore the scars of its past. It feels empty, Janet said one morning, staring out of the cracked living room window, like something's missing. It's the silence, Peggy reassured her, stroking her daughter's hair. We just have to get used to it. But Janet wasn't so sure. While the house had settled, a strange stillness lingered. The family noticed it first in the air, a dense quiet that muffled even the sounds from the street. The occasional creaks from the old wooden floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate. Margaret, usually the most skeptical, began to feel it too. Mom, she whispered one evening, do you ever get the feeling that we're still being watched? Peggy forced a smile. It's just our nerves. After everything we've been through, it'll all take time to feel normal again. But deep down, she wasn't sure. Determined to put the past to rest, Maurice decided to visit the house one last time. Though he had convinced Peggy that the worst was over, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was left unresolved. As he walked through the empty hallway, a sudden dizziness washed over him. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, stretching along the cracked wallpaper. Then he saw it in the reflection of the cracked mirror. A face, but not Eleanor. It was a man, gaunt, hollow-eyed, a figure drenched in malice. Samuel Redgrave. Maurice stumbled back, clutching his chest. The image vanished, but the suffocating presence remained. He never left, Maurice whispered, his voice trembling. That night, as the family slept, the house stirred. A rhythmic thudding echoed from the walls. The floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps. Janet awoke with a start, the familiar chill seeping into her bones. The whispers returned. I see you. Janet's eyes darted to the corner of her room, the same corner she had feared before. But this time the shadows moved. A dark figure emerged, its presence overwhelming. Leave me alone, Janet whimpered, pulling the blankets over her head. But the whispers grew louder. Peggy awoke to the sound of her daughter's cries, rushing into the room. It's back, Janet sobbed. He's back. Maurice and Guy returned the following morning. The tension in the house was undeniable. Janet's pale face and trembling hands told them everything. It's Samuel, Maurice confirmed grimly. We weakened him, but we never destroyed his hold on this place. Peggy's eyes filled with tears. I thought it was over. I thought we set Eleanor free. We did, he said softly, but Samuel's presence was never just about Eleanor. His darkness has rooted itself here. He fed on pain, suffering, fear. And now, Maurice added, he wants it back, preparing for the final confrontation. Determined to end the terror once and for all, Maurice proposed a final cleansing. Unlike before, this ritual would be far more dangerous. They would have to confront Samuel directly. We're not just asking him to leave, Maurice explained. We're severing his connection to this house forever. Despite their fear, Peggy and Janet agreed. They couldn't live like this anymore. As the sun set, candles were lit in every room. The air thickened, shadows danced along the walls, and a low hum echoed from the cracks in the floor. Samuel Redgrave, Maurice called, his voice firm. You are no longer welcome here. Show yourself. The house groaned in response. A foul wind swept through the rooms, and the walls trembled. Then he appeared, a twisted figure of bone and shadow, His hollow eyes gleamed with malice. "You think you can banish me?" Maurice held his ground. "You have no power here. The pain you caused ends now." The air in the Hodgson house grew thick, the weight of Samuel Redgrave's presence pressing down on everyone. The candles flickered violently, their flames trembling as though in fear. Maurice held the cleansing tools tightly, a bundle of sage, a bowl of salt water, and a bell to break the stagnant energy. Guy stood beside him, clutching a worn leather journal containing protective chants. Peggy and the children gathered in the corner, their hands trembling. Janet's eyes darted toward the shadows, sensing the same sinister presence she thought was gone. "Samuel," Maurice's voice echoed, steady but firm. "Your reign of fear ends tonight." The walls groaned. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the house. The air grew colder, and the shadows twisted unnaturally. Samuel's laughter echoed, a sound that chilled the soul. "You are nothing." Maurice lit the sage, the fragrant smoke curling through the air. He began to chant, his words firm and unwavering. "In the name of all that is light, I banish the darkness. You shall not remain." The shadows recoiled. The air crackled with tension. But Samuel was not retreating. The entity lashed out, the furniture trembled. A chair flung across the room with violent force. Peggy screamed, clutching her daughters tightly. "He's trying to scare us," Guy shouted. "Don't break the circle." Maurice nodded, his voice rising. "Spirit of malice, you abound no more. Depart from this place." A sharp wind howled through the house, the windows rattling. Samuel's distorted figure flickered, his hollow eyes burning with rage. But for the first time, there was something else. Fear. But even as Maurice pushed forward, Samuel's focus shifted, his chilling voice slithered through the air. "Janet." The girl froze. The shadows twisted toward her, whispering insidious words. Samuel's form loomed just beyond the candlelight, his dark presence invading her mind. "You can't escape me." But Janet's eyes were burned with defiance. Trembling, she stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're wrong." The house shook violently, but Janet didn't waver. She remembered Eleanor. She remembered the fear, but now she knew the truth. Samuel thrived on that fear. "You can't hurt me anymore," she said, her voice steady. "You have no power here." The moment Janet rejected him, a shift occurred. The darkness recoiled. Maurice seized the opportunity. He rang the bell, its sharp sound echoing like a crack of lightning. "By light and will, I cast you out." The shadows howled. Maurice threw salt water into the air, the droplets shimmering with energy. Samuel's twisted form writhed, his screams echoing through the walls. Guy joined in the chant, their voices intertwining with the rhythmic sound of the bell. "Be gone, spirit of torment. Return to the abyss from whence you came." The dark figure twisted in agony. The walls shook violently, cracks forming along the ceiling. The shadows shrank, and Samuel's presence flickered, weakening. With one final burst of light, the entity was gone. A deafening silence followed. The air lightened. The oppressive weight lifted. The house, though damaged, was finally at peace. Peggy sobbed, clutching Janet and Margaret. Maurice and Guy exchanged a weary look, the exhaustion evident on their faces. "It's over," Guy whispered. But Janet, her eyes still locked on the empty corner where Samuel once stood, knew something else. It wasn't just over. It was finished. The house no longer belonged to the darkness. The spirits that had suffered, like Eleanor, were free. Samuel Redgrave's reign of terror had ended. Peggy held her daughters tightly. "We're safe now." And for the first time in months, the Hodgson family believed it. Days passed, and the Hodgson house finally felt like a home again. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the comforting hum of everyday life. Sunlight streamed through the windows without resistance, and the air no longer carried the weight of fear. Peggy spent most of her time cleaning, determined to rid the house of the lingering reminders of the haunting. Janet and Margaret returned to their usual routines, though the occasional creak of the floorboards still made their hearts race. But even in the light of day, memories of Samuel Redgrave remained. Maurice and Guy visited once more, not to perform another ritual, but to investigate. Something about Samuel's presence still troubled Maurice. "There's always a reason spirits linger," Maurice said, sipping the tea Peggy had made. "We know Samuel was violent, a tormentor. But why this house? Why you?" Peggy shook her head. "We never knew anything about him until he started showing himself." "I've been thinking," Guy added. "Eleanor's spirit seemed tied to Samuel, It's possible she wasn't the only one he heard. Janet, listening quietly, suddenly remembered the whispers. The others, Samuel had said, they watched too. Her voice trembled as she spoke. What if there were more? More spirits, ones he never let go. The thought sent a chill through the room. Determined to uncover the truth, Maurice and Guy searched the local archives. Hours of digging through dusty records led them to something unsettling. A ledger from the 1920s. The Hodgson house, once owned by Samuel Redgrave, had a tragic history. Several servants had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors spoke of hearing screams in the night, but the investigations at the time had led nowhere. It was covered up, Maurice whispered. Samuel's wealth and influence kept the truth buried, but not forever, Guy added. When the Hodgsons moved in, it stirred everything. Samuel's spirit had remained shackled to the house, feeding on fear and pain. But now that he was gone, perhaps the other souls could finally be at peace. With a newfound sense of purpose, Maurice and Guy returned to the house. This time there was no fear, only determination. We need to offer them closure, Maurice explained. A proper cleansing, not to banish, but to release. Peggy nodded. They've suffered long enough. The ritual was simple. A white candle was lit in each corner of the house, illuminating the shadows without fear. Janet and Margaret stood beside their mother, their hands clasped tightly. Maurice's voice was calm, steady. To the lost and the forgotten, we see you now. May you find the peace denied to you. Go where the light calls you. You are free. A breeze swept through the room, gentle and warm. The flickering candles steadied, their flames glowing brightly. And then, silence. The air felt light. The house, for the first time, was truly empty. They're gone, Maurice whispered. All of them. In the following days, the Hodgson family found comfort in the absence of fear. The house no longer echoed with unseen footsteps. Laughter replaced the once dreaded silence. Maurice and Guy bid their final goodbyes, promising to stay in touch. Your strength saved this family, Maurice told Janet. Never forget that, Janet smiled. I won't. But as the investigators drove away, Janet stood by the window, watching the sunlight dance across the floor. The memories would always remain, but they no longer held power. The darkness was gone, and the Hodgsons could finally live without fear. Weeks passed, and the Hodgson house remained peaceful. Janet no longer woke to the sound of whispers, and the eerie creaks in the night were simply the house settling. Peggy resumed her usual routines, and Margaret even invited friends over without fear. Life had begun to feel normal again, but some things never truly fade. Late one evening, as the family gathered around the television, the warmth of the living room was interrupted by a faint tapping. It came from the wall behind the sofa. Peggy frowned. Did you hear that? Margaret nodded slowly. It sounded like knocking. Janet stiffened, her mind racing back to the nights when Samuel's presence had filled the house. But this time, the air didn't feel heavy. There was no icy chill. Still, the sound persisted. 3 soft taps. Maurice had told them that spirits sometimes linger, not out of malice, but simply because they hadn't finished their story. Later that night, as the rest of the family slept, Janet lay awake, her eyes fixed on the shadows of her bedroom. She listened. The house was silent, but the stillness carried a strange anticipation, as though something waited. Then faintly she heard it, a soft whisper, "Help me." Janet bolted upright, her chest heaving, but the voice didn't return. She gripped her blankets tightly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Samuel is gone," she whispered to herself. "He's gone." But deep down, Janet knew not all spirits had crossed over. The next morning, Janet shared her experience with her mother. Peggy's face paled, but she didn't dismiss it. "I thought we were free of all this," she murmured. "We might still be," Janet replied. "But what if there's someone else?" Reluctantly, Peggy agreed to call Maurice. When he arrived, he listened intently, concern etched on his face. "This isn't uncommon," he explained. "When a dark force like Samuel is removed, it sometimes leaves a gap. Other spirits may surface, ones that were suppressed by his presence. But this one," Janet interrupted, "it didn't feel evil. It was sad." Maurice nodded. "We may be dealing with a spirit in need, someone who never found peace." That evening, Maurice set up a simple seance in the living room. The small table held only a single candle, its flame steady and calm. Janet, Peggy, and Margaret sat around him, their hands linked. "Whoever you are," Maurice began, his voice gentle, "we invite you to speak. We mean you no harm. Tell us what you need." For a long moment, nothing happened. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. But then, the candle flickered. A cold breeze brushed past Janet's face, and a low, distant sob echoed through the room. Margaret's grip tightened around her mother's hand. "Please." The voice was faint, trembling. Maurice leaned forward, Tell us your name. A pause, then slowly the candle flame dimmed, and from the shadows a single word emerged. Eleanor. Janet's heart pounded. Eleanor? The girl Samuel killed? The air grew heavy, but not with malice, with sorrow. The shadows shifted, and for a brief moment, Janet saw her. A frail, translucent figure, her eyes wide with grief. Eleanor. I'm sorry, Janet whispered, tears welling in her eyes. We couldn't save you. Maurice's voice was steady. Eleanor, you are free now. Samuel is gone. You don't have to stay. But Eleanor's figure trembled. The others, they are still lost. Janet's breath caught. Others? Eleanor nodded. The room filled with a lingering sadness, the weight of forgotten souls. Samuel had tormented not only her, but many others. Their pains still echoed within the walls. Maurice sighed, his face etched with determination. We'll help them. Janet nodded. We will. The Hodgson family had survived the darkness, but now they had a greater purpose. To free those who had suffered in silence. And with Eleanor's guidance, they would begin. But as Janet extinguished the candle, she felt it. A distant gaze watching from the shadows. Not all spirits wanted to be set free. The house was silent once more, but the air felt different. Janet couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone still remained. Even though Eleanor had shown herself, her words haunted Janet's thoughts. The others, they are still lost. Maurice had promised to help, but he warned them that some spirits might resist. Not all wanted peace. Some were bound by anger, regret, or a hunger for vengeance. And those were the most dangerous. Days passed without further disturbances. The Hodgsons tried to return to normal life, but Janet's nights were restless. Dreams of shadowy figures and distant cries plagued her sleep. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Peggy noticed something strange. The air inside the room grew cold. The curtains shifted, though the windows were closed. And then, a faint whisper. Don't forget us. Peggy froze. The voice was distant, sorrowful. When she turned, nothing was there, but the chill lingered. That evening, she called Maurice. They're still here, she said, her voice trembling, and they're not at peace. Maurice and Guy arrived the next day. This time, they brought more than cameras and notebooks. They carried candles, cleansing herbs, and protective talismans. The spirit of Samuel may be gone, Maurice explained, but his influence might still remain. If other spirits were trapped here, his presence could have twisted them. Janet felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What do? We listen, Maurice said simply, and we help. That night, they gathered in the living room once again. The table was bare except for a single candle, its flame casting trembling shadows on the walls. The family formed a circle, hands clasped tightly. Maurice's voice was low, steady. To the spirits that linger, we are here to listen. Show yourselves. Speak your truth. For a moment, nothing happened. The candle flickered, but the room remained still. Then, without warning, a deep chill swept through the space. The walls groaned, and a low whisper echoed. He took everything. Janet's breathing quickened. Who? Who are you? The voice grew louder. He made us suffer. We were forgotten. The shadows along the walls twisted, forming vague shapes. Faces emerged, sorrowful, hollow-eyed, watching in silence. Maurice swallowed hard. We see you. Tell us how we can help. But the spirits didn't answer. Instead, the air filled with an overwhelming sense of despair. The candle's flame bent unnaturally, and a deep, guttural growl resonated from the walls. Not all wish to be free. Janet's heart pounded. What does that mean? Maurice's expression darkened. Some spirits hold on. They fear what awaits them beyond. And others, they crave power. The seance ended, but the oppressive energy lingered. Maurice warned that the house was still vulnerable. While Eleanor's spirit had been released, others remained bound. Some by trauma, others by choice. We must be cautious, Maurice said. Not all spirits will welcome our help. That night, Janet's dreams grew darker. She saw visions of twisted figures, their eyes glowing with malice. Among them was a familiar presence, Samuel. But his face was no longer his own. It was hollow, distorted, a monstrous reflection of the man he once was. When she awoke, her room was ice cold, and in the far corner, the shadows seemed to move. Samuel was gone, but something far worse had taken his place. Janet awoke, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. The shadows in the corner of her room had returned to stillness, but the unsettling feeling remained. She could no longer deny it. Something was watching. The house had changed. Even during the day, a constant tension lingered. The floorboards creaked without reason. The air felt heavy, and the once familiar room seemed foreign. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. But what were they waiting for? At breakfast, Peggy noticed the dark circles under Janet's eyes. "You're not sleeping, are you?" Janet shook her head, pushing her food around the plate. "It's back. I can feel it." Margaret, who had been trying to distract herself with schoolwork, finally spoke. "Last night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. But when I checked, no one was there." Peggy's face paled. "We need to call Maurice." By the time Maurice arrived, the atmosphere in the house had worsened. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Even Maurice, who had grown used to the unsettling presence of spirits, shifted uneasily. He set up his equipment, placing motion sensors and EMF detectors around the house. Guy, ever curious, carefully documented every reading. "This isn't just residual energy," Maurice muttered. "Something is feeding off the fear here." Janet's voice was barely a whisper. "Samuel is gone, but what if something else took his place?" Maurice nodded grimly. "That's a real possibility. The kind of darkness Samuel created can linger, and sometimes it attracts worse things." That night, Maurice suggested conducting another seance, but this time with protective measures. Salt lines were drawn at the entrances, candles were lit, and the family wore small blessed charms. "We're not inviting anything," Maurice clarified. "We're simply asking for answers." The circle formed once again, and the candle's flame flickered anxiously. Maurice's voice was calm yet commanding. "To whatever presence remains in this house, we ask you to reveal yourself." A moment passed. The silence deepened. Then a slow, rhythmic tapping began. 3 knocks. Peggy's breath caught. It was the same knock they had heard months ago during Samuel's reign of terror. Maurice clenched his jaw. "Who are you?" The candle flame bent unnaturally, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Then a voice, low, guttural, rasped through the room. "I am what he left behind." The temperature plummeted. Janet's hands trembled. "What do you want?" The voice rumbled. "Fear. It feeds me. I am eternal." Maurice's eyes flashed with determination. "You have no power here. You will not harm this family." But the entity only laughed. The shadows slithered across the walls, and Janet could swear she saw something within them, a face twisted and vile. "Then stop me!" And with that, the candle blew out. Maurice quickly lit the candle again, though the darkness clung to the edges of the room. "This thing is no simple spirit," he warned. "It's a remnant of the evil Samuel left behind, and it won't leave willingly." Peggy's voice quivered. "What can we do?" Maurice straightened. "We prepare. We cleanse this house once and for all. But this time we're not just facing a spirit. We're facing something that thrives on fear. We cannot let it win." Janet nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "We'll fight it." But deep within the shadows, the entity waited, and it had no intention of letting go. The next morning, the Hodgson house was eerily silent. Though the sun shone outside, the light barely seemed to penetrate the dimness within. Janet couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were listening, waiting. Maurice paced the living room, sketching symbols in his notebook. "We need to weaken it before it grows stronger. Fear is its fuel. The more afraid we become, the more powerful it gets." Peggy nodded. "But how do we fight something we can't see?" Maurice's eyes darkened. "We find its source." Determined, they began their search. Maurice believed the entity might be tied to something physical, a remnant of Samuel's influence. "Objects can hold energy," Maurice explained. "If we find whatever it's clinging to, we may be able to sever its hold." The family split up, carefully inspecting the house. Janet and Margaret searched the attic while Peggy and Maurice combed through the basement. The air grew colder the deeper they went. Suddenly, Janet froze. "Margaret, do you hear that?" A faint whisper, almost like a breeze, echoed through the attic. But there was no wind. "Janet," the voice was distant, familiar. It wasn't the guttural growl of the entity. It was something else. Janet's eyes widened. "Eleanor?" Following the voice, Janet carefully shifted aside old boxes and forgotten trinkets. Dust swirled in the air, illuminated by a single beam of light. Then, beneath a tattered blanket, she saw it. An old wooden chest. With trembling hands, Janet lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of weathered papers, photographs, and a porcelain doll with cracked glass eyes. Its face was eerily lifelike, frozen in a perpetual stare. Margaret gasped. That's from the old nursery. I remember seeing it in the pictures." Janet shivered. This must have belonged to Eleanor. Maurice entered the attic moments later, his expression grim. He examined the doll closely. This could be it. Objects connected to traumatic events often become vessels for dark energy. Janet hesitated. "So what do we do with it?" Maurice's voice was resolute. "We destroy it." That night, Maurice prepared the cleansing ritual. Salt lines were reinforced. Protective symbols marked the walls, and candles illuminated the dimly lit room. The doll sat at the center, its lifeless eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Once we start, the entity will resist," Maurice warned. "It will try to break us, but we must stand firm." Peggy clutched Janet's hand. "We're ready." Maurice began the incantation. His voice echoed through the room, commanding the darkness to release its hold. The air thickened and the shadows writhed. Then, the whispers returned. "You cannot stop me." The walls trembled. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam. The shadows twisted into monstrous shapes looming over the family. "Your fear belongs to me," Maurice shouted louder, his voice unwavering. "You have no power here." The shadows recoiled. The doll's porcelain face cracked, a thin fissure running down its cheek. "Leave this house!" A guttural roar erupted from the walls. The shadows thrashed violently, but Maurice's voice only grew stronger. Janet and Margaret clutched each other, their hearts pounding. The room grew unbearably cold. But just as the darkness seemed ready to consume them, the doll shattered. A burst of energy rippled through the air, and the shadows dissolved into nothingness. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in months, the house was still. Maurice slumped, exhausted but victorious. "It's over." Janet glanced at the shattered remains of the doll. "But was that really all of it?" Maurice's expression darkened. "We severed its hold. But whether the entity is gone for good, we may never know." The family stood in silence, the weight of what they had endured sinking in. But even as relief washed over them, Janet couldn't ignore the faint whisper that echoed once more, "I will return." The days following the cleansing brought a fragile peace to the Hodgson home. The oppressive heaviness had lifted, and the house no longer groaned with unseen forces. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating rooms that had once been shrouded in fear. But for Janet, the shadows still lingered. Even though the doll had been destroyed, a gnawing doubt remained. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of that final voice echoed in her mind. "I will return." Maurice and Guy visited one last time, inspecting the house for residual energy. The readings were low, and for the first time in months, the atmosphere felt normal. "The worst is over," Maurice assured Peggy. "But if anything changes, call me." Peggy smiled weakly. "Thank you, Maurice, for everything." Despite his reassurance, Janet noticed the slight hesitation in Maurice's eyes before he left. He wasn't completely convinced, and neither was she. That night, Janet's sleep was restless. She dreamed of the doll, its cracked porcelain face twisted into a grimace. The shadows slithered, forming monstrous shapes that whispered her name. But then, the dream shifted. A figure emerged from the darkness. A woman in a tattered white gown, her eyes hollow and her skin ashen. "Eleanor." "Janet," she rasped, her voice layered with sorrow. "You freed me, but it is not gone." Janet tried to speak, but no sound came. Eleanor stepped closer, her form flickering like smoke. "It waits beneath the walls. It will return." With a sudden jolt, Janet awoke. Her breathing was ragged, her heart racing. She scanned the darkened room. Everything was still, but the dream's warning clung to her. It will return. The next morning, Janet tried to shake the lingering fear. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Margaret noticed her sister's unease. "Janet, are you okay?" Janet hesitated. "I saw her. In my dream, Eleanor." She said, "It's not over." Margaret frowned. "But the doll is gone. The shadows are gone. Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks." Janet wanted to believe that, but something was different. The air had grown stale again. The walls, though silent, seemed to watch. That evening, Peggy called the girls for dinner. As they gathered at the table, a sudden bang echoed from upstairs. Peggy froze. "What was that?" Janet's stomach twisted. "It came from my room." Slowly, they ascended the stairs. Every step creaked beneath their feet. Janet's door was slightly ajar, the shadows inside darker than they should have been. Margaret reached for the light switch, but before she could flick it on, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. On the wall, scratched deep into the plaster, were 3 claw-like marks. The same marks that had appeared during Samuel's reign. Peggy's face paled. "No, it can't be." Janet's voice was barely a whisper. "It's back." Maurice was called immediately. As he stood before the ominous markings, his expression darkened. "It didn't leave. It's still here, waiting for the right moment to strike." Peggy's voice trembled. "What do we do now?" Maurice turned to Janet. "It's feeding on fear. That's how it survived. But we know what we're facing now, and this time, we fight it for good." Janet clenched her fists, determination burning in her eyes. "We end this." But as the night fell, the whispers returned, and from the shadows, something watched. The weight of the claw marks on Janet's wall loomed over the Hodgson family. It was undeniable. The entity was back. The false peace had shattered, and fear crept into their hearts once more. Maurice remained calm, though his furrowed brow betrayed his concern. "This time we'll be ready," he said firmly. Janet nodded, her resolve solidifying. She had endured too much to back down now. Maurice gathered his equipment, cameras, recorders, and electromagnetic sensors. He knew the entity would likely lash out again, but now they could document its movements and uncover its weakness. "It wants to instill fear," Maurice explained, "but if we confront it, we may weaken its power. Tonight, we provoke it." Peggy's voice trembled. "What if it hurts someone?" Maurice's eyes were steady. "It's already hurting you. We can't let it win." As night descended, the air in the house grew colder. The family gathered in the living room, the cameras rolling. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Then, a soft knock. It came from the wall, 3 deliberate taps. "Is someone there?" Maurice called out. The air grew dense. Then a faint whisper. It was Janet's name. "Janet!" She shivered, but she didn't flinch. "Why are you here?" she demanded. The whisper grew louder. "You freed her, but not me." Maurice's voice was firm. "Who are you?" No response. Instead, the walls groaned, as though the house itself was alive. The shadows began to shift. From the corner of the room, something emerged. A figure. It was hunched, its limbs twisted unnaturally. Its face was obscured, but its eye burned with hatred. Maurice held his ground, the camera capturing every horrifying detail. "You have no power here," he declared. "Leave this house." But the entity merely laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the walls. "This house is mine." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The furniture trembled. Objects were hurled across the room, narrowly missing the family. The entity's presence was overwhelming. Janet's voice broke through the chaos. "You're not welcome here. Go away." For a moment, the shadows paused. The laughter stopped. But then the figure lunged forward. Just as the entity approached Janet, a blinding light erupted from the corner of the room. A warmth spread through the air, forcing the darkness to retreat. Janet gasped. Eleanor, the translucent figure of Eleanor, the tormented spirit who once haunted the house, now stood protectively beside Janet. Her expression was sorrowful yet resolute. "You freed me," she whispered, "and now I will protect you." The entity screeched in fury, but Eleanor's presence grew stronger. The shadows twisted, fighting to remain. Maurice seized the moment. "Now you!" He began chanting the cleansing prayer, the words filling the room with a force that pushed against the darkness. Janet, Peggy, and Margaret joined in, their voices united. The entity thrashed, its form contorting, but the light consumed it. Piece by piece, it dissolved into nothingness. Then, silence. The house stood still. The air was light once more, free from the oppressive force. Maurice's voice broke the quiet. "It's gone." Peggy wept with relief, pulling her daughters into a tight embrace. Eleanor's spirit lingered for a moment longer, her expression peaceful. "Thank you," Janet whispered. With a final nod, Eleanor's figure faded, her soul finally at rest. But is it truly over? The following days passed without incident. Maurice and Guy analyzed the footage, confirming the entity's retreat. But as Janet stood in her room, staring at the space where the claw marks once were, she couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The shadows no longer spoke, the whispers had ceased, but deep within the silence, something unseen remained, watching, waiting, and Janet knew the house would never forget. Days had passed since the confrontation. The air in the Hodgson home felt lighter, and the oppressive presence seemed to be gone. Maurice and Guy had both reassured the family that the cleansing had worked, but Janet wasn't convinced. Despite the absence of shadows and whispers, a persistent unease gnawed at her. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights made her skin crawl. She told herself it was just paranoia, but was it? Late at night, Janet found herself unable to sleep. The memories of the entity's twisted form haunted her dreams. The whispers still echoed faintly in her mind, though now they felt distant, like something lurking just beyond the veil of reality. She wandered down the dim hallway, careful not to wake Margaret or Peggy. The house was eerily silent. Yet, as she passed by the empty living room, something caught her eye. The armchair in the corner. It faced the wall, slightly tilted, as if someone had just left it. But no one had been sitting there. Janet's heart pounded. She approached cautiously, reaching out to straighten it. But as her fingers brushed the fabric, A chilling sensation crawled up her spine. The chair was ice cold. The next morning, Janet couldn't shake the encounter. Over breakfast, she hesitated before mentioning it to her mother. "Mom, do you think it's really over?" Peggy paused, stirring her tea. "Of course, love. Maurice said the spirit's gone. The house feels different, doesn't it?" Janet nodded, though doubt lingered. "But what if something stayed behind? What if—" "Enough, Janet," Peggy interrupted, her voice firm. "We've been through so much. We need to believe it's over." Janet bit her lip. She wanted to believe, but something inside her whispered otherwise. That evening, Margaret sat on her bed, flipping through an old magazine. Janet sat across from her, pretending to read, though her thoughts were elsewhere. The room was still, but then a faint scratching sound echoed from the walls. Janet froze. "Did you hear that?" Margaret looked up, confused. "Hear what?" The sound came again. This time it was unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic scraping. Janet's eyes darted to the corner of the room, the spot where the claw marks had once been. But the wall was pristine. Not a single mark remained. "It's back," Janet whispered. Margaret shook her head. "No, you're imagining it. Maybe it's just the house settling." But Janet wasn't convinced. The sound had been too deliberate, too familiar. The following night, as Janet lay awake, the scratching returned. This time it was louder, more aggressive. She threw off her blankets and crept toward the wall. Her trembling hand reached for the light switch, but before she could flip it, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. Janet's breath quickened as she turned on the light, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The wall was no longer clean. The claw marks had returned, deep, jagged, and unmistakable. But this time, beneath the marks, something had been scrawled. A single word etched into the plaster: "Mine." Morning came and the marks remained. Peggy stood in shock as Maurice examined the wall. His face was grim. "This isn't possible," he murmured. "We cleansed the house. The spirit was expelled." Janet's voice trembled. "Then why is it back?" Maurice hesitated. "It could be residual energy or something worse." "Worse?" Peggy's voice cracked. Maurice lowered his gaze. "There are cases where entities become attached to a person, not a place." All eyes turned to Janet. The air thickened with the weight of the realization. "It's not haunting the house," Maurice said solemnly. "It's haunting Janet." The weight of Maurice's words hung heavily in the air. "It's haunting Janet." Janet felt a chill run through her body. The thought of the entity no longer being tied to the house, but to her, was unbearable. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but the claw marks on the wall spoke the truth. Peggy's voice trembled. "What does that mean, Maurice? What can we do?" Maurice's expression was grim. "A spirit that attaches itself to a person is dangerous. It feeds on fear, using it as fuel. It will try to break her spirit." "But why me?" Janet's voice cracked. Maurice hesitated. "It may see you as a vessel. Spirits often latch onto those who are emotionally vulnerable. It may believe it still has power over you." Janet's hands curled into fists. "Then how do we stop it?" Maurice's eyes softened. "We'll find a way. But you must stay strong, Janet. It wants you to give in." That night, the air in the Hodgson house grew colder once again. Even with every light on, shadows lingered in the corners. Janet sat on her bed, trying to steady her breathing. She gripped her blanket tightly, unwilling to close her eyes. But as the hours passed, exhaustion crept over her. Just as her eyelids began to droop, thud, a loud noise echoed from the hallway. Janet bolted upright, her heart pounding. She strained to listen, but the house was silent once more. Then, thud, thud, thud. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, like footsteps. But there was something unnatural about it. A dragging, shuffling gait. The door creaked. Slowly, Janet's voice barely escaped her lips. "Who's there?" The shadows in the corner shifted. For a moment, she thought she saw a pair of gleaming eyes. But when she blinked, they were gone. The next morning, Peggy noticed the dark circles beneath Janet's eyes. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" Janet shook her head. "It's still here. I heard it. It was outside my door." Peggy's eyes filled with worry. "We can't go on like this. Maurice needs to come back. Maybe there's something he missed." But just as Peggy reached for the phone, it rang. She froze, staring at it for a moment before answering. "Hello?" A low, raspy voice echoed through the receiver. "She is mine." Peggy gasped, dropping the phone. It clattered to the floor, the voice abruptly cutting off. Janet's hand shook. "It's not done with us." Maurice returned that afternoon, visibly disturbed after Peggy's frantic call. He brought with him a bundle of protective charms and holy water. "It's escalating, Doctor," he said. "The spirit is trying to wear you down, Janet. It's using your fear to grow stronger." Janet swallowed hard. "But why now? Why is it back after Eleanor's spirit saved me?" Maurice's face darkened. "There may be more than one entity. When Eleanor passed on, The spirit lost its opposition. Now it has free reign. Then how do we stop it? Janet asked. Maurice placed a hand on her shoulder. We sever his connection to you. But to do that, we must confront it once and for all. That night, Maurice set up candles in the living room, forming a protective circle. Peggy and Margaret watched anxiously as Janet sat at the center. We will call it forward, Maurice instructed, but do not engage with it. I will command it to reveal its purpose. Janet's heart pounded as Maurice began the incantation. The air grew heavy, the flames flickering violently. Spirit that lingers, show yourself, Maurice commanded. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped. A guttural growl echoed through the room. The shadows twisted unnaturally, and the oppressive presence returned. Janet, the voice was unmistakable. Deep, raspy, and filled with malice. You cannot hide from me. Janet's eyes locked on the far corner of the room. Slowly, the figure began to emerge. Its twisted form dragged along the floor, its hollow eyes glowing with hatred. Why are you here? Maurice demanded. The spirit's voice hissed. She is mine. She freed the spirit, but not me. Maurice's eyes narrowed. Who are you? The spirit's lips twisted into a cruel grin. I am the forgotten, the one who was never freed. Janet's breath caught. She realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't just any entity. It was something far more ancient, and it wasn't going to let her go. The entity's chilling words echoed through the room. I am the forgotten, the one who was never freed. The shadows around the spirit twisted unnaturally, its presence heavy with malice. Maurice stood his ground, though the tension in the air was unbearable. Who are you? Maurice's voice was firm. What do you want from Janet? The spirit's hollow eyes flickered. She is the key. Through her, I remain. Through her, I will return. Janet's heart pounded as she felt an icy chill creep up her spine. She tried to steady her breathing, but the spirit's presence was suffocating. Maurice, determined to uncover the truth, pressed further. Why Janet? Why not move on? The entity growled, its voice reverberating through the walls. I was cast away, forgotten, bound to this place. When the girl opened the door, I awoke. Janet's voice trembled. What door? The spirit sneered. The day you summoned me. The day you dared to speak to the other side. You called, and I answered. Maurice's eyes widened. He recalled the stories Janet had told, how she and her friends had played with an old spirit board months before the disturbances began. It wasn't Eleanor they had reached. It was something far darker. You never wanted to be freed, Maurice realized. You wanted to control, to possess. The spirit's grin twisted further, and I nearly did. But the girl fought, and now I wait. She weakens. Soon she will be mine. Peggy's fear turned to determination. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. You will not take my daughter. The spirit laughed, the sound echoing through the house. You cannot stop what has begun. But Peggy held her ground. She is not yours. She never will be. Maurice nodded, gripping the cross tightly. We will banish you. You have no power here. The spirit's eyes flickered with rage. We shall see. And with that, the shadows collapsed. The figure dissolved into a thick, black mist that slithered through the walls. The house was silent once more, but the tension remained. Maurice lowered the cross, his face grim. It's trying to break Janet down. The more fear it instills, the stronger it becomes. Then what do we do? Janet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We fight, Maurice said firmly. It feeds on fear pains, but it cannot stand against faith, strength, and resilience. He placed a protective charm in Janet's hands. This will shield you, but the battle is not over. We must prepare for what comes next. That night, Janet remained in her room, clutching the charm tightly. She could still feel the weight of the spirit's presence. Even though it had retreated, its eyes seemed to linger. She thought of Eleanor, the spirit who had once protected her. Was she truly gone? The house creaked softly, the familiar, unsettling sounds returning. But Janet didn't hide. She sat upright, refusing to give the spirit what it wanted. You won't win, she whispered to the shadows. I'm not afraid of you. But even as the words left her lips, the air grew colder. And in the darkness, the entity whispered back, we shall see. The shadows may have retreated, but their presence lingered. Janet couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant whisper in the dark, sent shivers down her spine. Peggy paced anxiously, her gaze never leaving Janet. We can't stay here, not while it's still in this house. Maurice shook his head. Running won't help. The spirit isn't tied to the house anymore. It's tied to Janet. Janet's hands trembled. But why me? What did I do to deserve this? Maurice's voice softened. It's not about what you did, Janet. It's about what was done in the past. Janet's confusion deepened. The past? Maurice nodded grimly. I believe this spirit has been here long before you ever moved in. Its rage was dormant, waiting for the right moment. And when you use the spirit board, you open the door for it. Determined to understand the entity's origins, Maurice suggested they dig deeper into the house's history. There may be something in the past that connects to the spirit. Something that will help us weaken it. Janet and Peggy agreed, though fear lingered in their eyes. Maurice returned hours later, clutching an old leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with time. This belonged to a man named Thomas Wilkes, Maurice explained. He lived here in the late 1800s, but what I found inside, it's disturbing. He opened the journal, revealing page after page of erratic handwriting. The words were scrawled in desperation, detailing the man's descent into madness. He claimed to hear voices, to see shadows that moved when no one was there. He believed the spirit of a woman haunted him, a spirit named Evelyn. As Maurice read further, the story grew darker. Evelyn was a servant who once lived in his house. She was accused of witchcraft by the Wilkes family. They believed she had cursed them when sickness plagued their children. Out of fear and anger, they sentenced her to death. Janet's eyes widened. But she wasn't a witch, was she? Maurice shook his head. There's no evidence that she was, but the hatred and injustice she faced may have bound her spirit to this place. And over time, her rage grew. Peggy clutched her chest, tears welling in her eyes. And now she's after my daughter? Not Evelyn, Maurice corrected. Evelyn's spirit was freed the night she protected Janet. But something else remained. Something born from the hatred and fear that consumed this house. Janet's voice trembled. The forgotten one. Maurice nodded solemnly. It's not Evelyn's ghost. It's a manifestation of the darkness that was left behind, and it's feeding on your fear. Peggy's voice was firm. Then we end it, whatever it takes. Maurice agreed. There is one way. We confront it. We force it to face the truth, the pain it caused, the lives it destroyed. Spirits like this thrive on denial. But if we bring its darkness into the light, it will lose its power. Janet's heart pounded. The thought of facing the spirit again was terrifying, but she knew there was no other choice. I'm ready, she whispered. Maurice met her gaze, his eyes full of determination. Then we face the forgotten one, and we end this once and for all. The decision had been made. They would confront the spirit. Maurice carefully outlined the plan. We'll conduct a cleansing ritual, but it won't be easy. The spirit will fight back. Janet, you'll need to stay strong. Janet nodded, her face pale but resolute. I'm ready. Peggy gripped her daughter's hand. We're with you. Maurice gathered the necessary items. Salt, sage, candles, and a blessed cross. The spirit has one weakness, the truth. When we call upon it, we'll force it to face its past. The air grew heavier as the sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows crept along the walls, and the house seemed to breathe with anticipation. As the ritual began, Maurice's voice echoed through the room. We call upon the spirit that lingers in torment. Reveal yourself and face the truth. The candles flickered violently. Janet's breath quickened. The oppressive cold returned, and a low growl rumbled from the shadows. You dare summon me? The spirit snarled, its voice layered with malice. Maurice stood firm. We do not fear you. You will no longer feed on the innocent. The spirit's form twisted from the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on Janet. She belongs to me. No, Janet's voice wavered, but she met the spirit's gaze. I am not yours. I never was. The spirit recoiled, but its rage grew. The walls trembled. The house groaned under the weight of its fury. We end this now, Maurice declared. The battle had begun. The air thickened as Maurice's chants grew louder. The spirit's twisted form loomed, its voice echoing through the room. You cannot banish me, it roared, the walls trembling with every word. The candles flickered violently, casting distorted shadows. Peggy clutched Janet tightly, refusing to let her daughter face the evil alone. Maurice raised the cross, his voice unwavering. You are no longer welcome in this house. By the light of truth, we cast you out. The spirit shrieked, its form writhing as if consumed by invisible flames. I was wronged. I was abandoned, it howled. Janet's trembling voice broke through. But you chose vengeance. You held on to your pain and spread it to others. It ends now. The spirit's hollow eyes bore into Janet's, searching for fear. But she stood firm, her resolve unshaken. Suddenly, the room blurred. Janet gasped as flashes of the past overwhelmed her mind. She saw a woman, Evelyn, bound and pleading for her life. The accusations of witchcraft rang out. The townspeople's faces twisted with anger. The spirit's growl rumbled. They condemned her, and I suffered. But within the vision, another figure appeared, a man, Thomas Wilkes. Guilt consumed his expression as he watched Evelyn's execution. Janet's voice was gentle yet firm, but Evelyn never sought revenge. It was your hatred that created this darkness. The spirit faltered. The twisted energy around it flickered. Maurice took the opportunity, his voice rising. Let go, spirit. Face the truth. The ground shook. The spirit's form began to crumble, tendrils of shadow unraveling. As the spirit weakened, it lashed out one final time. A burst of cold air knocked Maurice to the ground. The candles extinguished. The room plunged into darkness. But amidst the shadows, Peggy's voice rang out. You will not have my daughter. The mother's love burned brighter than the spirit's hate. She stood protectively before Janet, her arms trembling but steady. I banish you! Leave this house! The spirit screamed in agony. The shadows twisted violently before collapsing into nothingness. A deafening silence followed. Then slowly the oppressive weight lifted. The house exhaled, the air becoming still. Maurice staggered to his feet, his breathing ragged. It's over. Janet collapsed into her mother's arms, tears streaming down her face. It's really gone? Maurice nodded, his expression softened. The darkness is gone. Evelyn is at peace, and so are you. The house, though battered, now felt lighter. The malevolent presence had vanished. For the first time in months, the Hodgson family could breathe freely. But as they embraced, a single thought lingered in Janet's mind. Was it truly over? The morning sunlight seeped through the broken curtains, casting a pale glow across the Hodgson home. The once oppressive darkness had lifted, but an unsettling emptiness remained. Janet sat at the kitchen table, staring at her trembling hands. The events of the night echoed in her mind. The spirit's twisted form, its tormented cries. Peggy poured her a cup of tea, her eyes filled with concern. It's really gone, love. You're safe now. Janet nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. Then why do I still feel it? Maurice, standing near the window, turned toward her. It's natural. After experiencing something like that, the fear doesn't just vanish, but fear has no power unless you give it control. The house, though visibly unchanged, felt eerily silent. Every creak of the floorboards sent a chill through Janet. She couldn't shake the sense that something still lingered. While cleaning up the debris from the previous night, she noticed the spirit board, shattered and burnt, yet its darkened edges still pulsed with a strange energy. Maurice approached, sensing her unease. It no longer holds power, but it's best we destroy whatever remains. Together, they buried the remnants in the backyard. The earth swallowed the cursed object, sealing it away. That evening, Janet hesitated before stepping into her bedroom. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence deafening. She glanced at the corner where she once saw the spirit's form, half expecting it to reappear. But nothing came. Lying in bed, she tried to steady her breath. Peggy left the door slightly ajar, the soft glow from the hallway offering a semblance of comfort. Yet, in the stillness of the night, Janet awoke to a sound, a faint whisper. Janet, her heart pounded. She sat up, her eyes scanning the darkened room, but there was nothing, only the wind brushing against the window. It's just my mind, she whispered to herself. But as she lay back down, the whisper came again. This time, it was clearer. Help me. Janet froze. The voice wasn't menacing. It was sorrowful, almost pleading. The next morning, she rushed to Maurice, recounting the experience. His brow furrowed. The spirit is gone, but sometimes echoes remain. Not all spirits seek harm. Some simply want to be heard. Janet's voice trembled. Then, it wasn't the dark spirit? Maurice shook his head. Perhaps not, but we'll find out. Determined to uncover the truth, they decided to hold one final session. Not to summon, but to listen. If a soul is reaching out, Maurice explained, we may be able to give it peace. Janet's hand shook, but she nodded. I'm ready. But what awaited them that night would unravel a truth far more terrifying than they had imagined. Night descended once again. The air in the Hodgson home remained tense, as if the walls still remembered the torment that had unfolded. Janet, though fearful, was determined to face whatever lingered. Maurice set a small table in the center of the living room. Candles flickered, casting soft shadows. Peggy stood close by, her hands trembling, though she tried to appear calm for Janet's sake. We aren't summoning anything, Maurice reassured them. We're only allowing any lingering spirits to speak. He lit a bundle of sage, the smoke curling through the dimly lit room. If you are here, Maurice called out, If your voice remains, we are listening." For a long moment, there was only silence. The distant hum of the city streets outside seemed miles away. Then a faint knock. 1, 2, 3. Peggy gasped, clutching Janet's hand. "It's all right," Morris said calmly. "We are not afraid. If you wish to speak, give us a sign." The air grew heavier. A faint whisper echoed. The same sorrowful voice Janet had heard before. "Help me." Janet's hands trembled. "Who are you?" The candles flickered violently, and then a single name echoed through the room. "Evelyn." Maurice's eyes narrowed. "Evelyn?" The name from the visions. Janet nodded. "The woman who was accused of witchcraft. The one they condemned." The spirit's presence seemed to grow heavier, as though the weight of its sorrow was filling the space. "They lied," the voice whispered. "I wasn't the witch." Janet's heart pounded. Then who was? A moment passed. The air seemed to tremble with the spirit's answer. "Thomas." Maurice froze. The man who accused her? The one who claimed to be innocent? The spirit's anguished cry filled the room. "He was the one, but the town turned on me instead. I died with his sin on my soul." Tears welled in Janet's eyes. She could feel the overwhelming sorrow that Evelyn carried. "What do you want from us?" she asked softly. The spirit's voice came once more, quieter this time. "To be free. The truth must be known." Maurice's voice was steady. "Evelyn, you are heard. The truth will not be forgotten." A sudden rush of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. But this time it didn't feel threatening. The weight that had clung to the house seemed to lift, like a burden finally released. The spirit had found peace. The end of the haunting? Peggy held Janet close, tears of relief streaming down her face. Maurice lowered his head in respect, the silence now feeling calm. "She's gone," Maurice whispered, "and the house is truly free." But even as the night settled, Janet couldn't shake the lingering thought. Evelyn's torment had ended, but Thomas Wilkes' dark legacy remained. What if there's more? She wondered. And somewhere deep within the shadows, a question lingered. Had the darkness truly been vanquished? The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the living room. Despite the previous night's events, the Hodgson home felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had lingered for months was gone. But Janet couldn't shake the unease that remained. She paced the kitchen, the words of the spirit still echoing in her mind. "He was the one, but the town turned on me instead." Thomas Wilkes, the name held a sinister presence even centuries after his death. Evelyn's torment had ended, but Janet couldn't help but wonder, was Wilkes' darkness still out there? Maurice had stayed the night, determined to ensure the family's safety. The morning air was crisp as he sat at the dining table, sorting through his worn leather journal. "There's still something we're missing," he murmured, his fingers tracing the scribbled notes from the past few days. Janet watched him, curiosity and fear mingling. "You think Thomas Wilkes might still have a presence?" Maurice hesitated. "Spirits like Evelyn's, they seek closure. But Wilkes was different. If he embraced the darkness in life, his spirit may have done the same." A chill ran down Janet's spine. "Then how do we find out?" Maurice's eyes darkened. "We start by uncovering the truth. Every spirit leaves a trace." Later that day, Maurice took Janet and Peggy to the local archives. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. Rows of old records lined the shelves, their fragile pages whispering forgotten stories. A tired librarian adjusted her glasses as Maurice approached. "We're looking for records from the 1700s, specifically anything regarding Thomas Wilkes or Evelyn." The librarian frowned but nodded, leading them to a dimly lit corner. Boxes of historical documents lay untouched for decades. As Janet carefully sifted through the brittle papers, her eyes fell upon a faded parchment. The ink had smudged, but the name remained clear. "Trial of Evelyn Marsh, accused of witchcraft, 1764. Her heart pounded. But just beneath it, another document caught her eye. "Thomas Wilkes, Confession and Death." She gasped. "Confession?" Maurice quickly scanned the text. The words were harsh, the writing rushed. A record of Thomas Wilkes' final days. "He confessed on his deathbed," Maurice read aloud, his voice trembling. "He accused Evelyn to save himself, but the guilt consumed him. In the end, he claimed he could hear her cries. He said she would never forgive him." Janet's hands shook. "And now she's free. But what about Wilkes?" Maurice's jaw tightened. If his spirit remained, it may not be bound by guilt. It may have become something far worse. That night, back at the Hodgson home, the atmosphere had shifted once again. The warmth from earlier had been replaced by an eerie stillness. Janet sat by the window, staring into the darkened street. The lamplight flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. A sudden creak echoed from the hallway. Peggy tensed. "Did you hear that?" Maurice rose, his gaze narrowing. "Stay here." As he cautiously approached the corridor, the temperature plummeted. A strange, guttural whisper slithered through the air. You freed her, but not me. Janet's heart seized. It's him. The shadows along the walls twisted unnaturally. The air grew thick, a foul presence creeping through the home. Maurice's voice trembled. Thomas Wilkes never left. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The weight of the voice lingered in the air, sending a chill through the Hodgson home. Maurice stood frozen, his eyes locked on the shadows writhing along the walls. Janet clutched Peggy's hand tightly, fear coursing through her veins. Thomas Wilkes never left, Maurice whispered, his voice barely above a breath. The oppressive presence grew stronger, as if the very walls bore witness to the spirit's malevolence. The floorboards groaned beneath an unseen weight, and the shadows pulsed unnaturally. Why now? Janet asked, her voice trembling. Why is he still here if Evelyn is free? Maurice's gaze darkened. Because she was his anchor. While she remained, so did he. But now that she's gone, he has nothing to hold him back. A guttural whisper echoed through the room once more. You freed her. Now you face me. Maurice turned to Janet and Peggy. We can't face him like this. He's stronger now, fueled by centuries of hatred, but he's still bound to this house. We have to sever that connection. Janet's voice wavered. How? Maurice's eyes remained steady. We find what's keeping him tied to this place. A spirit like Wilkes often leaves behind a tether, an object, a mark, or a memory. If we destroy it, we weaken him. Peggy swallowed hard. And if we can't find it? Maurice didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said it all. The three of them moved cautiously through the house. Every corner seemed darker, every creak of the floor heavier. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional whispers that echoed from the shadows. In the basement, the air was damp and cold. Janet's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shapes along the stone walls. Boxes of forgotten belongings lay scattered, remnants of the home's past. Look for anything unusual, Morris instructed. Something that doesn't belong. Hours passed. Dust filled the air as they rummaged through old trunks and crates. But just as Janet was about to lose hope, her hands brushed against something cold. A rusted iron box. She hesitated, the mere touch sending a shiver through her spine. Maurice, I found something. He rushed over, carefully prying the lid open. Inside lay a small, tattered journal. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with time. Thomas Wilkes' journal, Maurice whispered, his voice grim. The air around them thickened. Shadows twisted, forming a looming figure in the dim light. A rasping voice echoed from the darkness. You found it, but you cannot stop me. The shadows coalesced, taking shape. A gaunt, twisted figure emerged, hollow eyes gleaming with malice. The air grew frigid as Thomas Wilkes' spirit stepped forward, his form flickering like a dying flame. I will never leave, he snarled. This house is mine. Janet's heart pounded, but Maurice stepped protectively in front of her. You were a coward in life, Wilkes, and you remain one in death. Wilkes let out a guttural laugh. You think you can free them? They are mine. Every soul I've consumed, every whisper in the night, I own them. The house trembled. Cracks splintered along the walls as a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the home. Maurice gripped the journal tightly. This ends now. The final battle had begun. The house groaned as though it were alive, a vessel for the malevolent spirit that had lingered for centuries. The air thickened with dread, and shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls. Thomas Wilkes' hollow gaze burned with rage. Maurice clutched the tattered journal tightly. Your sins are bound to these pages, Wilkes. This is your tether. Wilkes' voice boomed through the air. You cannot break what has already claimed me. This house is my prison, but it is also my domain. Janet's hands trembled as she backed away. If we destroy the journal, will it free him or make him stronger? Maurice's face was set with determination. It will weaken him. He has no power without the remnants of his guilt. But as Maurice prepared to tear the fragile pages, Wilkes roared. The shadows lashed out, throwing Maurice across the room. He crashed against the wall, gasping in pain. The journal tumbled from his hands. No, Janet screamed, lunging for it. Wilkes hovered above them, his form distorting, flickering like a dying ember. You think you can banish me? You are nothing. Your souls will join mine. The walls cracked. Paint peeled away as the whispers of countless souls echoed through the house. Ghostly apparitions flickered, shadows of Wilkes' past victims, trapped in his torment. But among them, a faint figure emerged, Evelyn. Her translucent form shimmered with a soft glow, her sorrowful eyes locked on Wilkes. No, Thomas, your hold ends here, Wilkes snarled. You cannot stop me. But Evelyn's voice remained steady. You condemn me, but your soul rots with the weight of your own sins. Face what you've done." The walls trembled violently. The spirits began to rise, their anguished cries turning into defiant whispers. "Free us." Mari, still clutching his ribs in pain, reached for the journal. "Janet, now." Janet grabbed the journal with trembling hands. "Wilkes, your time is over." Wilkes lunged forward, his distorted face twisted with fury. But Evelyn stood in his path, her presence forcing him back. Janet tore the first page. A guttural scream filled the air. She tore another, and the walls cracked further. With every rip of the journal, Wilkes' form flickered, his power waning. His voice became weaker, a hollow echo of what it once was. "You cannot. You will not." Maurice forced himself to stand. "End it, Janet." With one final tear, the last page disintegrated into ash. A shockwave of light burst through the house, sending the shadows recoiling. Wilkes let out a final anguished scream before his form collapsed into nothingness. The house grew still. The air lightened. The dark presence was gone. Evelyn's spirit smiled softly, her form fading. "Thank you." And then she was gone. Free at last. Days passed. The Hodgson family began to heal, though the memories would remain. The once ominous house now stood quiet, no longer burdened by its dark past. Maurice packed his belongings, preparing to leave. "Your family is safe now," he said softly. "Wilkes is gone." Janet hugged him tightly. "Thank you for everything." As the door closed behind him, Janet gazed around the house. Sunlight streamed through the windows. For the first time, it felt like home. But even as peace returned, a lingering thought remained. Not every spirit finds its peace, and some stories are never truly over. To be continued, the dark presence that once haunted the Hodgson family has been defeated. The restless spirit of Thomas Wilkes is no more, and Evelyn's soul has finally found peace. But the echoes of the past still linger. Some believe that the walls of the house remember everything: the pain, the fear, and the unspeakable horrors that unfolded within. Was it truly over? Or do the shadows of the Enfield Poltergeist still watch in silence, waiting for their moment to return? Paranormal investigators, skeptics, and believers continue to debate. Was this a genuine haunting or a mind consumed by fear? But one question remains. If this could happen once, could it happen again? Some stories are never truly over. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what we see, it's what we feel. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey. If you dare to explore more haunted tales and unexplained mysteries, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember,